On this channel, we've argued time and time again the battle droids of the Confederacy of Independent Systems were much better than fans give them credit for. But not all battle droids were created equal. Some were disposable and produced in vast numbers and deployed in hordes on the Clone Wars' front lines. Others were specialists, expensive but extremely powerful units that far exceeded the capabilities of any organic soldier. In this video, we're going to compare the four most prominent Separatist battle droids, the B1, the B2, the Droidica, and the BX Commando, to see which design was best.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Let's start with the classic, the good old B1 battle droid. B1s have a reputation as flimsy and useless, and indeed, individual B1s were often underwhelming. These skeletal droids were easy to destroy and outwit, and though they could fire a blaster, that was about all the stock models could do. But what's important to remember about the B1 battle droid is the droid's designers at Bactoid Combat Automata were never concerned with individual performance. The B1 was designed for mass deployment, and it fulfilled this purpose quite well. Bactoid never intended for the B1 to be some sort of next generation super soldier. That would have been prohibitively expensive. Instead, they designed the B1 to play to the greatest strengths that battle droids had, central control computers and the ability to be mass produced. A single B1 was insignificant, but an army of B1s, coordinated with perfect precision by an orbiting droid control ship, could be unstoppable. Furthermore, because the B1 was so cheaply designed, they could be produced in such vast numbers that no army of organics could hope to outnumber them. For all their individual flaws, B1s as a collective were a force to be reckoned with. Then there's the B2 super battle droid. This droid was essentially a compromise between the extreme mass producibility of the B1 and the superior quality of organic soldiers. Even more so than the B1, the B2 was profoundly stupid, but it made up for this with strength, firepower, and durability. Each B2 was heavily armored, able to shrug off multiple blaster bolts before finally collapsing, and they were armed with powerful wrist blasters with a high rate of fire. On the front lines of the Clone Wars, the B2's enemies feared the droid, and for good reason. Typically, Separatist commanders tried to integrate the B2 into the mass deployment strategy usually employed with B1s. On many battlefields during the Clone Wars, B2s composed the front lines of droid army columns, while B1s hid behind their armor and fired on the enemy from afar. This strategy worked pretty well, but it was a team effort, and the B2 was less impressive without the backing of its older counterparts. While the B2s were still mass producible, they couldn't be manufactured in absurd numbers like the B1s, and while they were powerful, the clones of the GAR quickly found ways to destroy them. In other words, the B2 suffered from the jack of all trades, master of none effect. Moving on, let's take a look at the more elite Separatist droid models, beginning with the Droidica. The Droidica was infamously powerful, a challenge for even the Jedi. It was a highly unusual droid model, a result of its origins. While the other droids we're discussing in this video were Bactoid products, the Droidica was a product of the Colicoid creation nest, and thus designed to fit Colicoid's sensibilities. In particular, it emulated the Colicoid body shape, had the ability to curl up into a ball and roll around, and was equipped with an onboard shield generator. This shield made the Droidica incredibly difficult to destroy, as it was virtually impregnable. Opponents had to be extremely creative to bypass or overload it. Even without the shield, Droidicas were tough, bearing heavy-duty armor, if not as heavy as B2 super battle droids. They were also well armed, equipped with 2 dual blaster cannons capable of punching through light vehicle armor. Since Droidica's shields were polarized, they could fire these blaster cannons even with their shields up, allowing them to cut down whole squads of enemy soldiers without receiving a single scratch. However, the Droidica also had a few big shortcomings. If they were somehow knocked over while their shields were still up, contact with the ground would overload the shield and cause the generator to explode. Furthermore, Droidicas had to disable their shields and stow their weapons to move any meaningful distance, as when their shields were deployed, they could only waddle. Of course, when their shields were down, they curled into a ball and rolled to get around. Their tripedal nature also made them easy to knock over and practically impossible to deploy on uneven or muddy terrain. Finally, droidicas were extremely expensive, which meant the Confederacy could only manufacture them in limited numbers. The fourth and final droid we're looking at is the BX series Commando droid. The BX was a lot like the B1, but much more heavily armored and agile. It also possessed a number of special abilities, including infiltration programming, the ability to mimic voices, and a built-in fusion cutter to slice through blast doors. Essentially, the Commando droid was what the B1 could have been if Bactoid had set out to create the perfect soldier instead of exploiting the strengths unique to battle droids. The Commando droid was extremely effective. It performed well as a sniper, an elite soldier, a mimic, and well, a commando. Its best attribute by far was its agility. Commando droids were faster and more agile than any non-force sensitive human, giving them a significant advantage over Republic clone troopers. However, they weren't perfect. They were expensive, and even though they were skilled, they were often outmatched by clones. No matter how well designed a battle droid was, there were always organic soldiers that were better, and many Commando droids learned that lesson the hard way. Now for the comparison. We're not going to be comparing individual droids here, but rather which line of droids was the most effective as a whole, so as to level the playing field. At the bottom of our list, we actually have the Droidica. Don't get us wrong, Droidicas were powerful, but they had too many weaknesses, and their utility was extremely limited during the Clone Wars. They were relatively immobile, extremely expensive, and worst of all, they couldn't be deployed on most Clone Wars battlefields. It doesn't matter how powerful your droid is if you can't use it half the time, and on the whole, Droidicas made far less of an impact in the Clone Wars than the other three droids. In the number 3 spot, we have the B2. As we mentioned earlier, the B2 was a jack of all trades, but the master of none. It was tough, but less so than the clones and Jedi it fought. It had a lot of firepower, but again, the clones and Jedi weapons packed more of a punch. It could be deployed en masse, but not to the extent of the B1s, and they were rarely seen in overwhelming numbers. The B2 was a great droid, like the Droidica, but none of its strengths stood out, and it relied on the support of B1s to be effective. Now that leaves us with just the B1 and the BX. We would consider those two droids the two extremes of the Separatist droid army. The BX was the ultimate soldier, designed for maximum individual efficacy, while the B1 was a horde warrior, designed to exploit the greatest advantages of battle droids. Of the two, we'd say that the more effective model was the B1. This is for one simple reason. As we mentioned earlier, no matter how strong the Commando droids were, there were always organics, and Jedi especially, who could outmatch them. In trying to be perfect soldiers, the Commando droids were competing against organic soldiers' greatest strengths. The B1s, on the other hand, were designed to play to the droids' greatest strengths. Their designers knew that no droid could hope to beat organic soldiers at their own game, so the B1s were never designed to play said game. They were instead designed for mass production, deployment in vast numbers, and coordination by central control. When Separatist commanders played to the strengths of the B1, they often won, and for good reason. Given sufficient numbers, an army of even the worst soldiers can overwhelm a smaller, more elite force. Even Jedi could only do so much against 100 droids firing at once. At the height of the Clone Wars, the combined total of B1 battle droids outnumbered every other army in galactic history, and they surely would have brought the Separatist victory in the Clone Wars had Sidious not been pulling the strings. But that's just our opinion. What do you think? Do you think another droid model was more effective than the B1? Let us know your opinions in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.